I want you to understand something right from the start. It wasn't about revenge. At least, it wasn't at first. In the beginning, it was just about surviving. Surviving the pity, the whispers, the suffocating weight of being the woman my husband, the great poet Julian Croft, left behind for the whole world to see. Surviving the final, exquisite cruelty he'd authored for me. He was always so good with endings. So let me take you back to how this all started. If you've ever felt small, if you've ever been made to feel like a footnote in your own life, then you'll know exactly the kind of quiet, airless room I was living in. And maybe, just maybe, you'll understand why I eventually decided to tear the whole house down. The day my life imploded was a Tuesday, a ridiculously normal gray Tuesday in October, the kind of day that's already forgotten by Wednesday. The air in the solicitor's office was thick with the smell of old paper, lemon polish, and insincere condolences. It was a stuffy, wood-paneled room, designed to make you feel insignificant before a word was even spoken. And it was working. I sat on a stiff leather chair that sighed every time I shifted my weight, feeling like a ghost at my own husband's funeral. Across the mahogany desk sat Serena. Her grief was as beautiful and curated as she was, dressed in a simple, obscenely expensive black dress, her blonde hair pulled back in a chignon that probably took an hour, her blue eyes shimmering with just the right amount of tragic moisture. She was Julian's muse, the inspiration he'd told the world for his final brilliant collection. She was 26. I was 48. The math was as brutal as everything else. Next to me, Julian's family formed a united front of quiet disappointment. His older sister, Beatrice, a woman who wore her pearls like armor, gave me a look that managed to be both pitying and accusatory. His younger brother, Marcus, a man who had coasted his entire life on Julian's reflected glory, just stared at the Persian rug, unable to meet my eye. They had never thought I was good enough for their brilliant, tortured Julian. His final act had just proven them right. Then there was Mr. Albright, the solicitor, a man whose face seemed to be made of dry parchment. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. He began to read the last will and testament of Julian Croft. It was all very formal, very procedural. A few minor bequests to distant relatives, a donation to a writer's colony. My heart was a cold, hard stone in my chest. I wasn't expecting anything. Not really. The emotional inheritance had been transferred to Serena long ago. I was just there for the public part of the humiliation. And then it came. Mr. Albright adjusted his glasses. He said to Serena Dubois, "My muse, my guiding star, the vessel of my art, I leave the entirety of my literary estate. This includes all current and future royalties, all intellectual property, all manuscripts, notes, and personal effects currently housed in my study, as well as the publishing rights to my complete works." A small, perfectly controlled sob escaped Serena's lips. She pressed a delicate hand to her mouth. Beatrice reached over and squeezed her arm in a gesture of solidarity that felt like a knife twisting in my gut. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just watched this performance, this final chapter of the life I had helped build, being handed over to a girl who had walked into it when the paint was already dry. The literary estate wasn't just money, it was his legacy. It was the 40,000 books in our home, the smell of his pipe tobacco clinging to the curtains, the weight of his fountain pen. It was the life I had curated so he could create. Mr. Albright cleared his throat again, a nervous little flutter this time. He looked at me, and for the first time, a flicker of something that might have been discomfort crossed his face. "And to my wife, Karen Croft," he read, and the room seemed to hold its breath, "in acknowledgement of our years together, I leave the small cedar box in my closet, the one marked unsent letters." Silence. A thick, ringing silence that was louder than any shout. The cedar box. I knew the one. A simple, plain box he'd kept on the top shelf, always out of reach. I'd asked about it once, years ago. He had just smiled that distant, charming smile of his, and said it was where he kept his ghosts. Now it was my inheritance. A box of ghosts. Serena looked at me, her blue eyes wide with a carefully practiced sympathy that was more insulting than outright contempt. Beatrice's expression was one of pure, unadulterated pity. This was it. The final poetic humiliation Julian had crafted for me. The world-famous poet leaves his fortune and his legacy to his beautiful young muse and to his long-suffering wife. A box of old letters. The gossip columns would feast on it for weeks. The family would whisper about it for years. Karen, the poor, discarded wife, left with nothing but a sentimental, worthless box of his old mail. It was a story, and Julian had always been a master storyteller. He had written me into the role of the tragic, forgotten woman. And in that moment, in that stuffy, silent room, I had no choice but to play the part. I simply nodded, my face a mask of numb composure. What else was I supposed to do? Scream? Weep? I had done all my weeping in private, in the long, lonely nights, while he was off being brilliant with her. This was just the epilogue. The drive home was a blur. The house, our house, felt cavernous and hostile. Every object screamed his name. The worn armchair where he read, the stacks of poetry journals on the coffee table, the faint scent of his cologne in the hall. For 25 years, I had been the curator of this space, the silent partner in the business of Julian Croft's genius. I had organized his life, managed his schedule, typed his manuscripts, fended off the world so he could have the quiet space to write his beautiful soaring words. I had been the scaffolding that held up the cathedral, and now the cathedral had been bequeathed to someone else, and I was just the leftover timber, tossed in a box. That night, I didn't cry. I was beyond tears. I was in a state of shock so profound it felt like a strange, cold clarity. I walked up to our bedroom, to the closet that was now half empty. On the top shelf, just as he'd said, was the cedar box. It wasn't heavy. I brought it down and sat on the edge of the bed we had shared for a quarter of a century. The air was cold. The house was silent. For a long time I just looked at it. A box of unsent letters. Were they love letters he'd written to her but never had the courage to send? Were they angry letters to me? What final petty torture was waiting inside? My hands were shaking as I lifted the simple brass latch. The scent of cedar and old paper filled the air. Inside, neatly bundled with twine, were dozens, maybe hundreds of letters. They were written on his familiar cream-colored stationery, in his elegant, spidery handwriting. I picked up the top one. The envelope was addressed not to me, not to Serena, but to a name I hadn't heard in years. Elias Vance. Elias Vance. Julian's mentor. The man who had discovered him at a university reading and championed his early work. Elias had been a poet himself, a quiet, scholarly man who had faded into obscurity just as Julian's star began to rise. He died a decade ago. Why on earth would Julian be writing to a dead man? My heart began to beat a little faster. This wasn't what I expected. I carefully untied the twine from the first bundle and pulled out a letter. It was dated 15 years ago, right around the time Julian was struggling with a terrible case of writer's block, just before he began working on what would become his masterpiece. His prize-winning collection, the one that made him a household name, Echoes of Althea. I began to read. My dearest Elias, the letter began. It has been an age, I know. Forgive my silence. I find myself in a peculiar kind of hell, a desert of my own making. The well is dry. The words which once came so easily are now stones in my mouth. I sit at my desk for hours, and all I can hear is the infernal ticking of the clock, mocking me. You were right all those years ago. Talent is a fickle ghost. Mine seems to have departed for good. I kept reading, my breath catching in my throat. Letter after letter detailed his despair, his fear of failure, his jealousy of other writers. It was a side of Julian I had only glimpsed, a raw, terrified insecurity he had always hidden behind a wall of charm and arrogance. I felt a pang of the old familiar sympathy. The poor tortured artist. It was the role he played best. But then, about halfway through the bundle, the tone changed. There was a letter dated a few months after the first one. Elias, it said, I don't know how to thank you. Your package arrived today. To hold it in my hands, it feels like sacrilege. To call this manuscript a collection of old fragments is the most profound understatement of the century. This isn't fragments. This is a finished, breathing thing. Althea, the world you built here it's a universe. I have spent the entire day reading it, and I feel like a child who has just been shown the inner workings of the stars. My blood ran cold. Manuscript? What manuscript? I frantically searched for the next letter in the sequence. It was dated a week later. Elias, I've been thinking about what you said on the phone. That the work is the only thing that matters. That the vessel is unimportant. You said you were done with it, that you wanted it to have a life, even if it wasn't under your name. I know your health is failing. I know you feel the world has passed you by. But to offer this to me, it is a gift too great, a burden too heavy. I cannot simply take it. My conscience, what little remains of it, screams at the thought. I had to sit down. My legs felt weak. I sank onto the floor. The letters spread around me like fallen leaves. I could hear Julian's voice in my head, a conversation from years ago. I'd asked him where the name Althea came from. He'd given me a wistful, poetic smile, and said, She came to me in a dream, my love. A whisper from the ether, a whisper from the ether, or a manuscript from Elias Vance. I found the final letter in the series. His handwriting was shakier now, more urgent. Elias, I have made a decision. I will do it. I will honor the work as you asked. I will be its vessel. I will rework it, weave parts of myself into its fabric, and present it to the world. It will live. That is the most important thing. Your name will not be on the cover, but your soul will be in its pages. And one day, I swear to you, I will make this right. I will tell the truth, but not yet. I am not strong enough. Forgive me. This is my confession, and this is my promise. I dropped the letter as if it had burned my hand. It was all there. A confession. A detailed, gut-wrenching confession. Echoes of Althea, the book that won the National Book Award, the Pulitzer, the book that was taught in universities across the country, the foundation of his entire celebrated career, was not his. He hadn't stolen it, not in the traditional sense. It had been given to him, a dying mentor's last gift, or perhaps his last desperate act to see his work survive. But Julian had taken the credit. He had built his kingdom on another man's land, and he had lived with that lie for 15 years. These letters, they weren't his ghosts. They were his conscience, trapped in a box. A promise to tell the truth that he never fulfilled. For a moment I just sat there on the floor of our bedroom, the silence of the house pressing in on me. The public humiliation, the affair with Serena, the insulting inheritance, all of it fell away. That was just a simple garden variety betrayal. This was something else entirely. This was a lie that had rewritten literary history. A lie that had earned him millions of dollars, and a permanent place in the poetic canon. And he had left the proof in my hands. Why? Was it a final desperate act of a guilty man, hoping I'd be the one to finally carry out his promise? Or was it the ultimate act of arrogance? Did he believe I would be too loyal, too grief-stricken, too weak to ever reveal it? Did he think I would just burn the letters, protecting his precious legacy even in death, just as I had protected his life? I looked around the room, at the life we had built, the awards on the mantelpiece, the framed photos of him shaking hands with presidents and rock stars. It was all a mirage, a beautiful celebrated fraud. And Serena, the beautiful muse who had supposedly inspired it all, was just the final, decorative lie on a cake of deceit. She hadn't inherited a legacy, she had inherited a crime scene. A strange feeling began to unspool inside me. It started as a cold knot in my stomach, and slowly, very slowly, began to burn. It wasn't grief. It wasn't even anger. It was something new, something sharp and clear, and powerful. It was the feeling of a lock clicking open. They all thought he had left me with a box of worthless memories. A final romantic insult. They were wrong. He hadn't left me with a memory. He had left me with a weapon. He had left me with the truth. In his will he had given Serena his intellectual property. But with this box he had given me something far more valuable. He had given me the copyright to his reputation. And I realized sitting there on the cold floor that my period of mourning was officially over. It wasn't about revenge. Not yet. It was about justice. It was about a quiet poet named Elias Vance, who had died in obscurity while my husband became a legend. It was about the truth. But I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that in the pursuit of justice, I was going to get a hell of a lot of revenge. The story Julian had written for me was over. It was time for me to start writing my own. The first days after the discovery were a haze of sleepless nights and frantic obsessive reading. I went through every single letter in that cedar box, arranging them chronologically, cross-referencing dates with Julian's old calendars and my own memories. It was like being an archaeologist, slowly dusting off the bones of a hidden history. The letters to Elias were the core, the undeniable proof, but there were others. Unsent drafts to his publisher, full of self-aggrandizing lies about his process. An angry unsent letter to a critic who had dared to suggest his style in Althea was a significant departure from his earlier work. He'd called the man a fool, a literary tin ear. Reading it now, I felt a chill. The critic had been right. He'd heard the echo of another voice in the poems, and Julian, terrified, had lashed out. I felt like I was losing my mind, living in a parallel reality where the man I had known for 25 years was a complete stranger. Every memory was now tainted, every achievement fraudulent. The pride I had felt at his awards ceremonies curdled into shame. The sacrifices I had made, the lonely dinners, the cancelled vacations, all so he could work on his masterpiece, they were all in service of a love. Was I a fool? Or had I been a willing accomplice, so desperate to believe in his genius, that I refused to see the signs? This question haunted me. It was a classic, debatable piece of character logic, I suppose. Had I chosen to be blind? Maybe. Loving Julian required a certain amount of willful blindness. My breakdown didn't come in a storm of tears. It was a quiet implosion. It happened a week after the will reading. I was in his study, the room that was now Serena's by law, but was still filled with the ghost of him. I picked up a first edition of Echoes of Althea. The dedication page read, "4K, my anchor in the storm." I laughed, a dry, brittle sound that broke in the middle. An anchor. I wasn't an anchor. I was ballast. I was the dead weight he carried to keep his stolen ship upright in the storm of his own fraud. That's when I sank to the floor, right there on the Obeson rug he'd been so proud of, and I finally let the full weight of it all hit me. The betrayal wasn't just about the book, it was about our entire life. Our life had been the elaborate stage dressing for his lie. My support, my love, my quiet competence. It wasn't just unappreciated, it was necessary for the crime. I was the alibi, the respectable wife who made the brilliant tortured artist seem plausible. I remembered a trip to Paris, years ago, our 10th anniversary. He was supposed to be taking a break, but he spent the entire week locked in the hotel room, frantic, irritable. He was in the early stages of writing Althea. I remember walking along the Civil by myself, feeling so utterly alone, telling myself it was the price of admission for loving a genius. I remembered him emerging one evening, his eyes wild, euphoric. He showed me a stanza he'd just written, one of the most famous from the book. It just came to me. "Karen," he'd whispered, his voice full of awe, like a voice from God. I had goosebumps. I told him he was a conduit, a vessel for something beautiful. Now I knew the truth. He wasn't a conduit. He was a plagiarist, a gifted one, but a plagiarist nonetheless, and I had been his first and most devoted audience. The catalyst for my resolve came not from a moment of anger, but from a moment of pure, unadulterated condescension. It was a phone call from Serena. She was she said, just checking in on me. Her voice was a syrupy blend of pity and power. Karen, darling, she cooed. I know this must be so difficult for you. I'm having a small, intimate gathering next month to celebrate Julian's life and work, a few close friends, the publisher. We're announcing the new legacy edition of Althea. Of course you must come. It's important that we all present a united front. A united front. She wanted to parade me around as the grieving widow, giving her my tacit endorsement. I would be the final piece of set dressing for her new role as the keeper of the floor. And about the house, she continued, her voice turning slightly more businesslike. I don't want to rush you, of course, but the estate needs to be settled. Perhaps you could start thinking about your arrangements, my arrangements. She was kicking me out of my own home, and she was doing it with the gentle, patronizing tone one uses on a confused, elderly Something inside me snapped, not loudly, but with the clean, quiet crack of a glacier calving into the sea. The despair, the grief, the confusion, it all solidified into a single diamond-hard point of purpose. Serena, I said, my voice startlingly calm. Thank you for the offer, but I don't think I'll be able to make it to your party. I'm going to be quite busy. Oh? She asked, a hint of surprise in her voice. Doing what, darling? I'm beginning a new project, I said, the words forming themselves as I spoke. A comprehensive biographical study of Julian's creative process, a sort of companion piece to his work. I'll need full access to the archives, of course, all his notes, drafts, and correspondence, as per the terms of the will, which left me all his personal correspondence, sent or unsent. There was a beat of silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in her pretty little head. She couldn't refuse. It was in the will. And what could be more harmless than the old wife wanting to potter around with his old papers? It was pathetic, really. It suited the narrative perfectly. Of course, she said finally, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Whatever you need, Karen. It's wonderful that you're finding a little project to keep you occupied. A little project. She had no idea. After I hung up the phone, my hands were steady, my mind was clear, the fog had lifted. I knew exactly what I had to do. The letters were my core weapon, but a weapon is useless without a strategy. I couldn't just release them. It would be my word against the sainted memory of Julian Croft. Serena and the family would paint me as a bitter, unstable liar. No, I had to build a case, an airtight, irrefutable case. I had to become a scholar of my husband's fraud. My first call was to Delia Sanchez. We had been best friends in college, two firebrands ready to take on the world. I went into publishing. She went to law school. She was brilliant, sharp, and had a bullshit detector that could find a lie from 100 paces. Julian had never liked her. He said she was too cynical, too abrasive. The truth was, she saw right through him, and he knew it. Over the years, our friendship had faded, a quiet casualty of my marriage. I hadn't spoken to her in almost 5 years. It took all my courage to dial her number. She answered on the second ring. Delia Sanchez. Her voice was exactly the same, brisk, no nonsense. Delia, it's Karen, Karen Croft. There was a pause. Karen. My God. I was so sorry to hear about Julian. I sent a note. I wasn't sure if you'd... I got it. Thank you. It meant a lot, I said, and I was surprised to find that I meant it. Listen, Delia. I'm in trouble. Or rather, I think I'm in possession of something complicated. I need a lawyer, but more than that, I need a friend. Can I buy you a drink? We met that evening at a quiet bar she suggested, a place with dark wood and low lighting. I told her everything. I laid it all out. The will, the humiliation, Serena, the box, the letters. I watched her face as she listened, her sharp, intelligent eyes missing nothing. She didn't interrupt. She just let me talk until the whole sordid story was out. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment. She took a slow sip of her scotch. Let me get this straight, she said. her voice low and even. The literary lion of his generation, the great Julian Croft, built his entire reputation on a book he didn't write. And he left you the confession, gift-wrapped. That's about the size of it, I said, my voice hoarse. She shook her head slowly, a slow, grim smile playing on her lips. That magnificent, insecure bastard, she whispered, almost to herself. It's almost poetic. Then she looked at me, her eyes locking onto mine. Okay, first things first. This is not about revenge. I must have looked surprised, because she held up a hand. I'm not saying you don't deserve it. You do, in spades. But if we frame this as a scorned wife getting even, we lose. They'll crucify you. Serena will be the victim, the poor innocent girl protecting her dead lover's legacy from his crazy, jealous widow. No, this is about two things, and two things only: literary ethics and contractual fraud. I stared at her. Contractual fraud. Think about it, she said, leaning forward, her voice electric with energy. Julian signed a contract with his publisher, warranting that Echoes of Althea was his own original work. It wasn't. That's fraud. Every royalty check he ever cashed was fraudulent. Every advance, every foreign rights sale. Serena didn't inherit a literary estate. She inherited a massive multi-million-dollar liability. The publisher could sue the estate for every penny they ever paid out. My mind was reeling. I had been so focused on the moral betrayal, I hadn't even considered the legal or financial implications. This was why I needed Delia. And the letters, she continued. The will is a gift. It specifically bequeaths you all personal correspondence, sent or unsent. That gives you ownership and control of the physical letters. We can argue that it also grants you the right to control their content, especially for the purposes of correcting a historical and fraudulent record. The line in the will about the unsent letters isn't just a poetic insult, Karen. It's a legal hook. It's our way in. She was right. The phrase copyright to his reputation that had formed in my head was just a metaphor. Delia was giving me the steel framework of the law to build it on. So what do? I asked. We do nothing. For now, she said. We gather our ammunition. You said you have access to the archives? I nodded. Serena practically insisted. She thinks I'm making a scrapbook. Perfect. Delia grinned. You are going to be the most devoted, meticulous, grieving scholar this world has ever seen. You are going to go through every single piece of paper in that study. Every draft, every note, every grocery list. You're not looking for a smoking gun. You already have a whole arsenal. You're looking for corroboration. You're looking for Julian's handwriting on notes about Althea that seems stilted or confused. You're looking for anything written by Elias Vance. You are going to build a timeline so detailed, so irrefutable, that by the time we're done, no one will be able to question it. Her words were a balm. For the first time in months, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. I had a plan. A secret plan. There's one more thing, I said, my voice dropping. Elias Vance. He's the key to all of this. He's the ghost at the center of the story. I think I need to find his family. Delia nodded slowly. That could be powerful. A living human being who can speak to his legacy. But it's also a risk. They could have their own agenda. They could want to take this public in a messy way. I have to try, I said. It's not just about Julian anymore. It's about him. Elias. His name has been erased. I need to give it back to him. And that was the start of my double life. By day I was Karen Croft, the tragic widow, pottering about her late husband's study, a figure of pity to Serena and the literary world. I would see Serena occasionally. She would swan in, smelling of expensive perfume, and ask me how my little projects was going with a breathtaking lack of awareness. I would smile wanly, and show her some innocuous note I'd discovered. He was just so brilliant, wasn't he? I'd say, and she would nod, her eyes shining. It was a nauseating charade, but every moment of her condescension just fueled the fire inside me. By night I was a detective. I sat with Delia in her office, surrounded by law books and takeout containers, piecing together the fraud. We hired a private investigator, a discreet man named Peterson, to track down any living relatives of Elias Vance. It wasn't easy. Vance had been a recluse in his final years. He had no children of his own, but Peterson found a trail, a beloved niece who had inherited his meager estate. She had passed away, but she had a daughter, a granddaughter. Her name was Clara Vance, and she was a librarian at a small university in Oregon. The day Peterson gave us her name and address felt like a seismic shift. Clara Vance. She was real. This wasn't just about letters in a box anymore. There was a person, a legacy with a living heir. The hidden leverage was piling up. I had the letters. I was finding more and more in the archives. Scraps of paper where Julian had clearly been practicing forging Elias Vance's poetic style, trying to mimic his unique cadence. It was clumsy, almost pathetic. Then I found the Holy Grail. Tucked inside an old forgotten copy of the Aemenid was a thin, faded photograph. It was of a young Julian and an older, kind-faced man, their arms around each other smiling. On the back in Julian's handwriting it said, "Me and Elias, summer of '98, the master and the thief." The thief. He had written it himself. Delia and I decided it was time to make the first move. It wouldn't be a frontal assault. It would be a whisper. A single carefully placed stone that would start an avalanche. I knew just the person to talk to. A man named Alistair Finch. He was one of the most respected and feared literary critics in the country. He was old school, a man who cared deeply about literary integrity. He and Julian had had a complicated relationship, a sort of respectful rivalry. Alistair had always been a little suspicious of Julian's sudden dramatic shift in style with Althea. I invited him for tea. I told him I was working on a biographical project and had uncovered some fascinating and perplexing correspondence. I showed him a single letter, one of the early ones, where Julian confesses his writer's block to Elias. Then I showed him a letter from after the publication of Althea, where Julian talks about the burden of his genius. I didn't show him the confession. Not yet. I just laid the two letters side by side. Alistair read them, his brow furrowed. He read them again. He looked up at me, his sharp eyes full of questions. His style, Alistair said, his voice a low rumble, the prose in his letters. It's so different between these 2 points in time, almost like two different men, isn't it? I said, taking a calm sip of my tea. I found it puzzling. I didn't need to say another word. I had planted the seed of doubt in the most fertile ground imaginable. Alistair Finch was a dog with a bone. He wouldn't let this go, and so the silent takeover began. It was no longer about my grief or my humiliation. It was a chess game, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't a pawn. I was the queen, and I was about to put the entire board in check. My first move was as quiet as a key turning in a lock. It wasn't a press conference or a tell-all interview. It was an email. A carefully worded scholarly inquiry, sent from my new official-looking email address, k.croft.literary.studies. I sent it to Alistair Finch. I attached a high-resolution scan of the photograph I'd found, the master and the thief, and a heavily redacted transcript of one of the more damning letters. I blacked out most of the text, leaving just a few tantalizing context-free phrases. A gift too great, a burden too heavy, and your soul will be in its pages. And this is my confession. My email was brief and academic. Alistair, I wrote, further to our conversation, I've uncovered some correspondence between Julian and his mentor, Elias Vance, that raises fascinating questions about their collaborative process. I'm particularly struck by the intensity of their bond. I thought this might be of interest for your research. I knew Alistair. Giving him a puzzle like this was like giving a cat a ball of yarn. He wouldn't be able to resist pulling the thread. 2 days later, the first tremor hit. A blog post appeared on the website of a highbrow literary journal, written by Alistair Finch. It was titled, "The Ghost in the Machine," re-examining the genesis of Echoes of Althea. It didn't make any direct accusations. It was far more clever than that. It was a piece of masterfully suggestive criticism. He praised Julian's genius, but then he wondered aloud about the influences. He wrote about the forgotten poet, Elias Vance, describing his unique melancholic style. He then pointed out the uncanny stylistic resonance between Vance's obscure early work and Julian's celebrated masterpiece. He ended the piece with a question. Is it possible that Julian Croft's greatest work was not a monologue, but a dialogue with a silent partner? The post went viral in the literary world. It was linked and debated on Twitter, in university English departments, and on fan forums. It was the perfect opening salvo. It wasn't an attack from a bitter widow. It was a serious question raised by a respected critic. It made the story about the art, not about the drama. Serena's panic was not immediate. At first she was dismissive. She even called me, her voice tight with annoyance. Karen, have you seen this nonsense Alistair Finch has written? It's utterly baseless. I'm half tempted to have the estate's lawyers send him a cease and desist. Oh, I wouldn't do that, I said, my voice calm and gentle. It would only make it look like you have something to hide. It's just academic speculation, isn't it? It will blow over. But it didn't blow over. The opposite happened. Other critics, smelling blood in the water, started chiming in. Old reviews of Althea were dug up, particularly the ones that had noted the sudden shift in Julian's voice. The narrative was slowly, subtly changing. The real panic started when Serena's publisher called her. They were in the final stages of preparing the multi-million-dollar legacy edition of Althea, complete with a new introduction written by Serena herself. The book was Julian's cash cow, and by extension, hers. Delia had a friend who worked in the legal department of that publishing house. She told us the story later. The publisher's CEO, a shrewd man named Robert Marchand, had read Alistair's piece. He had called an emergency meeting. Their lawyers were now re-examining the original contract Julian had signed. The one with the original bail clause. They were getting nervous. Marchand called Serena and asked her if there was any truth to the rumors. This is when Serena's beautiful poised facade began to crack. She called me again. The sweetness was gone. Her voice was sharp, brittle. Karen, what did you say to Alistair Finch? She demanded. This is your doing. You're trying to tarnish Julian's name out of spite. I have no idea what you're talking about, Serena, I said. And the beauty of it was, I was telling the truth. I had no idea what Alistair was going to write. I had simply provided him with a piece of the puzzle. I'm just a grieving widow, remember? Working on my little project. This isn't a project. This is a demolition, she shrieked, her voice rising. The publisher is threatening to delay the legacy edition. Do you have any idea how much money is at stake? Her money. It was always about the money. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, with perfect practice sincerity. Perhaps if you gave me more complete access to the archives, I could find something to disprove Alistair's theory. There must be early drafts, notes, something that shows Julian's original process for Althea. I knew, of course, that those drafts didn't exist. The only drafts in that study were of him trying to copy Elias's work. It was a trap, and she walked right into it. Fine, she snapped. Fine. Look at whatever you want. Just find something to make this go away. She gave me the key to the locked filing cabinet. The one she'd previously told me contained only boring old tax documents. Inside, I found what I was half expecting, half hoping to find. It was a folder labeled E.V. Correspondence. It contained not just more unsent letters from Julian, but a small handful of actual mailed letters from Elias Vance to Julian. Faded, frail letters, written in a shaky hand. One of them contained a line that made my blood freeze. Julian, Elias wrote, I am glad the manuscript is in your hands. But you must be careful. Your genius is for performance, for the grand gesture. Mine was always for the quiet truth. Do not let your voice drown out the soul of the work. Althea deserves a gentle shepherd, not a conquering king. A gentle shepherd. Julian had been a conquering king. And this letter was the proof that the exchange wasn't just in Julian's imagination. It was real. Elias knew. Meanwhile, our investigator Peterson had confirmed that Clara Vance was indeed Elias's great-niece and sole living heir. He'd done a background check. She was a quiet, serious academic. No scandals. No drama. She was perfect. Delia and I drafted a letter to her. It was the most difficult letter I have ever had to write. We didn't lead with the fraud. We led with respect. I introduced myself as Julian Croft's widow, and explained that I was conducting research into his work, specifically his relationship with his mentor. I told her I had come across correspondence that suggested a deep and profound creative collaboration between the two men, particularly concerning echoes of Althea. I wrote that I believed her great-uncle's contribution had been unfairly overlooked by history, and that I was committed to correcting the record. I ended by asking if she would be willing to speak with me. I didn't mention the confession. I just offered the possibility of justice for her family's name. We sent the letter via registered mail, and then we waited. It was the longest week of my life. During that week, Serena's panic escalated into full-blown hysteria. The publisher officially put the Legacy edition on hold, citing the need to clarify the book's provenance. That word, provenance, was like a dagger in the heart of Julian's reputation. It was the word used for art, for antiques, for things that might be forgeries. Serena's counter-manipulation campaign began. She gave an exclusive interview to a glossy magazine. The photos were breathtakingly beautiful. Serena, looking tragic and brave in Julian's study. The article was a masterpiece of spin. She painted me as a sad, lonely woman, unhinged by grief, who was now lashing out at the memory of the husband she had lost first to his muse, and the death. She talked about my obsessions with the archives, my bizarre theories. She even hinted that I was mentally unstable. It's a tragedy. She was quoted as saying, a single tear glistening on her cheek. Karine was a part of Julian's life for a long time, but his art lived in a place she could never go, and I think she's trying to destroy that world because she was never truly a part of it. It was a brilliant move. It was also a fatal mistake. It made her the story. It made me the victim, and it made people wonder why was she protesting so much. Then came the call from Julian's sister, Beatrice. Her voice, usually so imperious, was laced with an unfamiliar tremor of anxiety. Karine, she said, dispensing with any pleasantries. This has gone far enough. The family is being humiliated. What is this all about? What do you want? I want the truth, Beatrice, I said calmly. The same thing you should want. The truth about your brother. Julian was a great man, she insisted. You are dragging his name through the mud over some academic squabble. Was he? I asked. A great man who leaves his wife of 25 years a box of letters and everything else to his 26-year-old girlfriend. A great man who builds his career on the work of a dying friend. Is that the man you want to defend? There was a choked silence on the other end. What? What are you talking about? She whispered. Ask Serena, I said. Ask her to show you the early drafts of Althea, the ones in Julian's own hand. Oh wait, they don't exist. I hung up the phone. I knew the family's loyalty was not to truth or to me. It was to the name Croft and the prestige it carried. The moment that prestige was threatened by scandal, their allegiance to Serena, the pretty but disposable asset, would evaporate. The final piece fell into place 3 days later. An email arrived in my inbox. The sender was C. Vance. My heart stopped. I opened it with a trembling hand. Dear Mrs. Croft, it read. My name is Clara Vance. I received your letter. I have been the keeper of my great-uncle's papers for many years. Among them is the original complete manuscript of a collection of poems he wrote in his final years, a collection he called Althea. I would be very interested to talk to you. I read the email 3 times. I printed it out and held the paper in my hand to make sure it was real. She had it. She had the original manuscript. It wasn't just a confession in a box anymore. It was a fact, a verifiable, physical fact. The power had shifted completely. It was no longer a matter of opinion or interpretation. It was a matter of evidence. Serena was trying to fight a war of public relations, but I was preparing for a trial, and I had just found my star witness. I held Julian's confession, a corroborating letter from the victim. And now, the victim's heir was holding the original copy of the stolen goods. The game was over. They just didn't know it yet. The family exodus began not with a bang, but with a series of quiet, frantic phone calls. The first was from Marcus, Julian's younger brother. He had always been the weaker of the 2 siblings, a man living in the shadow of Julian's enormous talent and ego. His entire social standing was built on being the great poet's brother. "Karine," he said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "Bea told me what you said. About Althea. Is it true? You have to tell me. People are starting to ask questions. My club, they're looking at me funny." His club, that was what it came down to. Not the truth, not the honor of a dead man named Elias Vance, but his own social discomfort. It was so perfectly, predictably selfish. "Why don't you ask Serena, Marcus?" I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "She's the executor of the estate. She holds all the records. I'm sure she can clear it all up for you." "I tried," he said, his voice cracking with frustration. "She's a mess. She just keeps screaming about you being a vindictive liar. She's not denying it, Karine. Not really. She's just deflecting. It's making everyone nervous." It wasn't about revenge, until it was. In that moment, listening to his panic, I felt a cold, sharp thrill of satisfaction. For years the Croft family had treated me like a piece of furniture, a necessary but uninteresting part of the household. Now they were coming to me, the discarded wife, because their precious world was starting to crumble. "I have a meeting with my lawyer next week to review some documents," I said calmly. "Perhaps you and Beatrice should be there, if you're truly interested in the family's legacy." I hung up before he could respond. The next to crumble was Beatrice. She didn't call, she showed up at my door. The house I was now renting, a small anonymous place that Serena had no doubt gossiped about. Beatrice stood on my doorstep, stripped of her usual armored hauteur. She looked smaller, older. "He adored you, you know," she said, without preamble. It was such a stunningly manipulative opening that I almost had to admire it. In his own way, he was a complicated man. "He was a fraud, Beatrice," I replied, not unkindly. I didn't need to be cruel. The facts were cruel enough. He was a gifted, charming, and deeply insecure man who built his life on a lie, and you all benefited from it. You bathed in his reflected glory without ever asking if the light was real. Tears welled in her eyes. They might have even been genuine. "What are you going to do, Karine? Are you going to destroy him?" "Destroy us?" "Destroying him was his own project," I said. "I'm just publishing the results. Julian left me a confession, Beatrice. He wanted the truth to come out. Maybe he was too cowardly to do it himself, so he left the dirty work to me. The dutiful wife, cleaning up one last mess. That I knew was a debatable piece of logic. Was it cowardice or the ultimate act of narcissistic control, making me the agent of his posthumous drama? I didn't know the answer, and I didn't care, but it was a version of the story that would resonate with a family that had always enabled him. It reframed my actions as loyalty, not revenge. Her shoulders slumped in defeat. "Serena is a fool," she muttered. "We backed the wrong horse." The raw, transactional nature of the statement was breathtaking. Not we were wrong, but we backed the wrong horse. The desperate counter-manipulation from Serena reached its peak a few days later. She must have known her allies were abandoning her. She tried a new tactic, bribery. She sent a lawyer, Not Mr. Albright, but a sleek, aggressive man in a sharkskin suit, to meet with Delia and me. He offered a settlement, a very generous one, a lump sum of $2 million, and I could keep the house. All I had to do was sign a non-disclosure agreement and turn over the box of letters. Delia just smiled. My client isn't interested in money, she said, enjoying herself immensely. She is interested in correcting the literary record, an endeavor I'm sure your client, as the current executor of a major literary estate, can appreciate. The lawyer's face tightened. Let's be clear, he said, dropping the pretense. You release those letters, you're not just torpedoing an estate, you're inviting a lawsuit from the publisher that will bankrupt it. My client will be left with nothing. You'll destroy the value of the very thing you're fighting over. The estate is already worthless, Delia countered smoothly. It's a ticking time bomb of fraud. My client is actually doing the publisher a favor. She's giving them a way to get ahead of the story, to reissue the work ethically, and to save themselves from the biggest literary scandal of the century. You should be thanking us. After he left, fuming and defeated, I looked at Delia. $2 million, I said, shaking my head. A few months ago, that would have been a life-changing amount of money. Now it felt like an insult. It was never about the money, Karine, she said, echoing my own thoughts. It was about them acknowledging what they did, what he did. Serena's final pathetic attempt at control was straight out of a bad movie. She tried to get the letters. She somehow got the key to my rental house and let herself in while I was out. I came home to find my small apartment in disarray. My desk drawers were open, papers were scattered. It was a clumsy, frantic search, but I wasn't an amateur. The cedar box wasn't there. It was safe in a vault at Delia's law firm, and every single letter had been professionally scanned and digitally archived. I called the police and filed a report, breaking and entering. Now, on top of everything else, Serena had committed a crime, not just an ethical one, but a real one. With a police report, the power had not just shifted, it had created a whole new geography. I was on high, solid ground, and they were all sliding into the sea. The final confrontation was now inevitable. It was time to set the terms of their surrender. The confrontation wasn't a shouting match in a living room. That would have been too messy, too emotional. This was a corporate execution, and it needed a boardroom. Delia arranged the meeting at the publisher's head office. In attendance were Robert Marchand, the CEO of the publishing house, his head of legal, a pale and shaken Serena, accompanied by her sharkskin lawyer, and at my request, Beatrice and Marcus Croft. They were there as representatives of the family, but really they were there as witnesses. I had spent the morning preparing not for a fight, but for a presentation. I wore a simple, well-tailored gray suit. Delia had insisted I buy. My hair was pulled back. My hands were steady. It pulled back. My hands were steady. When Delia and I walked into that boardroom, all eyes turned to me. I saw surprise, and for the first time, a glimmer of fear in Serena's eyes. This was not the frumpy, grieving widow she had dismissed. This was someone else entirely. We sat down. The tension in the room was so thick you could taste it. Marchand, the publisher, spoke first. Mrs. Croft, Karine, he began, his voice grave, we find ourselves in a delicate situation. There are allegations, rumors really, that are proving very damaging to Julian Croft's legacy, and frankly to our business. We need clarity. Serena's lawyer started to speak, to bluster about baseless smears, but Delia held up a hand. There's no need for that, she said, her voice cutting through the tension. We are all here to find a solution, not to trade accusations. My client has no desire to destroy Julian Croft's literary legacy. On the contrary, she wishes to secure it, by correcting it. I placed a single slim folder on the polished mahogany table. I didn't bring the cedar box. I didn't need it. The threat was more powerful than the execution. Inside this folder, I said, my voice even and calm, you will find 3 documents. The first is a signed and notarized affidavit from Miss Clara Vance, the great-niece and sole living heir of the poet Elias Vance. I paused, letting the name hang in the air. I saw Beatrice and Marcus exchange a nervous glance. Miss Vance attests that she is in possession of a complete handwritten manuscript of a collection of poetry by her great-uncle, dated 1998, titled Althea. She has given us permission to have the manuscript authenticated by any expert of your choosing. Marchand's face went gray. Serena looked like she had been slapped. The second document, I continued, my gaze fixed on Serena, is a preliminary report from a forensic document examiner. It compares known samples of Julian's handwriting from that period, with notes and drafts related to Althea's found in his archives. The report concludes, and I quote, a high probability of stylistic imitation and compositional uncertainty, which is a technical way of saying he was trying to copy someone else's work, and wasn't very good at it at first. And the third document, I said, sliding the folder across the table towards Marchand, is our proposal. We are calling it the Vance Protocol. Marchand opened the folder. The room was utterly silent, save for the faint rustle of paper. I had them. Not with threats, not with anger, but with facts, evidence, and a business plan. Delia took over, laying out the terms in her crisp legal voice. The Vance Protocol is straightforward. First, the legacy edition of Echoes of Althea's will be cancelled. It will be replaced by a new definitive edition. This new edition will be co-credited to Julian Croft and Elias Vance, with Vance's name appearing first. Serena let out a strangled gasp. You can't do that. We can, Dela. We can, Delia said, not even looking at her. Second, the introduction will be replaced with a new historically accurate essay, detailing the collaborative genesis of the work. My client, in conjunction with Miss Clara Vance, will oversee the writing of this essay. She continued, ticking off the points. Third, Serena Dubois will voluntarily step down as executor of the literary estate, effective immediately. A new executor will be appointed, chosen by agreement between my client and Miss Vance. Fourth, and this is non-negotiable, Delia said, her voice like steel, 50% of all past and future royalties from Echoes of Althea's, from the very first dollar ever earned, will be paid to a new charitable foundation established in Elias Vance's name. The Vance Foundation will provide grants to overlooked and emerging poets. The estate will make a retroactive payment of all monies due within 90 days. Marchand looked up from the proposal, his eyes wide. He wasn't looking at it as a scandal anymore. He was looking at it as a solution. A brilliant marketable solution. A story of redemption, of literary justice. It was a better story than the one he had before. And if we refuse? Serena's lawyer asked, though his voice lacked any real conviction. Delia smiled a thin, dangerous smile. If you refuse, then we hold a press conference tomorrow morning. We will release the unsent letters. All of them. We will provide the full forensic report to the New York Times. We will support Miss Vance in a copyright infringement and fraud lawsuit against the estate that will not only bankrupt it, but will also name the publishing house as a party for failing to do its due diligence. The scandal will destroy Croft's entire back catalog, not just Althea's. It will be the end of everything. Or, she said, her voice softening, you can sign this agreement. You can be the heroes who helped uncover the truth and honor a forgotten master. The choice is yours. It was a checkmate, a complete and total victory. Serena was staring at me, her face a mask of disbelief and pure hatred. You did this, she hissed. You miserable, jealous old woman. You couldn't stand that he loved me, that he chose me. I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time without any pain or anger, and all I felt was a profound, weary pity. She still didn't get it. She thought this was about her. He didn't choose you, Serena, I said, and my voice was surprisingly gentle. He chose his lie. You were just the final chapter. The problem is, he forgot that I was the one who held the epilogue. I stood up. I believe we're done here. Let us know what you decide. Delia and I walked out of that room, leaving the wreckage behind us. The new reality had dawned. It wasn't a world where I had won, and they had lost. It was a world where the truth had simply been put back in its rightful place. I hadn't destroyed Julian's legacy. I had rectified it. And in doing so, I had reclaimed my own. The quiet, invisible wife had finally found her voice. And it was the loudest sound in the room. 6 months have passed since that day in the boardroom. The world looks different now. Or maybe I just see it more clearly. The Vance Protocol, as Delia so brilliantly named it, was signed within a week. There was no other choice for them. Serena, stripped of her role and her unearned income, vanished from the literary scene. I heard she moved back to California, to live with her parents. Her 15 minutes of fame as the great poet's muse had ended in disgrace. Beatrice and Marcus Croft faded back into the quiet, wealthy obscurity from which they came. They attend the occasional family function, but their central point of pride, their famous brother, is now a source of complicated shame. We don't speak. There is nothing left to say. The new edition of Echoes of Althea was released last month. On the cover, in clean, elegant font, it reads Elias Vance and Julian Croft. Seeing his name there first felt like a deep, satisfying breath after being underwater for too long. The book is a bestseller all over again, but for a different reason. The story of its creation, the truth I brought to light, has become a phenomenon. Critics have hailed it as a landmark moment of literary justice. I worked with Clara Vance on the new introduction. She is a wonderful woman, quiet, intelligent, and fiercely protective of her great-uncle's memory. We spent weeks together, going through his papers, piecing together his life. We became friends. Last week we stood together at the launch event for the Vance Foundation. It was held at the New York Public Library, and the room was filled with poets, students and readers. When Clara announced the first recipient of the Elias Vance Grant, a young brilliant poet from a small town in Ohio, the applause was thunderous. I stood at the back of the room and watched, and for the first time in so long, I felt a sense of profound peace. It was done. It was right. I didn't keep the house. I couldn't. It was full of too many ghosts, not of Julian, but of the woman I used to be. I live in a small apartment downtown now, a place that is entirely my own. It has big windows, and lots of bookshelves, which I am slowly filling with books written by women, by new voices, by people who have their own stories to tell. I am no longer the curator of someone else's life. I am the architect of my own. So what's the moral of this story? I suppose it's that legacies are fragile things. They are not carved in stone. They are written on paper, and paper can burn, or it can be rewritten. They all thought that box of unsent letters was Julian's final word, the closing sentence in my humiliation. But they were wrong. They weren't his last word, they were my first. My name is Karen Croft, and I am the woman who held the copyright to her husband's reputation. But I realize now that my real inheritance wasn't the power to destroy him. It was the power to finally set myself, and the truth, free. Thanks for listening to my story. It's been a long and complicated journey, and I'm sure some of you might have made different choices. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Would you have released the letters and destroyed his legacy completely? Or was correcting the record the right thing to do? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you've ever felt like a footnote in your own story, I hope this gives you a little bit of strength. Don't forget to like this video, and subscribe to the channel for more stories about finding your voice when you think it's been lost for good. Thanks for being here with me today.